Hi, I'm Jacob Kruger, and I'm going live with my final analysis of Game of Thrones. We're going to look at the very final episode, and we're going to talk about what went wrong. But more importantly, we're not just going to jump on with all the negative feelings about this episode. Everybody knows the problems of the episode. But what we're really going to do is we're going to look at it as screenwriters, and we're going to say, okay, for everything that's wrong, for all the problems, for every bit of disappointment, what is really going on with this episode, and what can we learn from it as screenwriters? It's important to remember, while everybody's jumping on asking for David Benioff and D.B. Weiss's heads, that these are the same writers who gave you all the episodes that you loved, who gave you the Red Wedding, the Battle of the Bastards, Hodor, right? All these moments that you fell in love with Game of Thrones. These were all the same writers. Now, granted, they were working off of George R.R. Martin's book, and obviously there are aspects of adaptation that are different than writing when you're beyond the book or without the book. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about what potentially went wrong. So why did these same writers that were able to give us all these wonderful episodes that we completely fell in love with, why are these same writers struggling in season 8? And what made this episode just feel like it fell apart for most people who watched it? Well, it's important to remember when you are working on an adaptation that it's almost like someone's already done the rough draft of your script. When you are adapting a novel, when you are adapting a play, when you're adapting a short story, a true life story, even a poem, it's like someone's already written the rough draft for you. The reason I say rough draft, that is no knock on George R.R. Martin's writing. Obviously, those novels are very complete. But the reason I say rough draft is that you have something that is not yet a script. So when you are reading a Game of Thrones book, you have a fabulous book, but it's not yet a screenplay. And so the act of adaptation is taking this thing that is not yet a screenplay and adapting it into screenplay form, choosing what you're going to keep and what you're going to cut, where you're going to be truthful to the plot and where you're going to diverge, what elements need to be externalized in order to be dramatized, and which elements are already working. So when you're working inside of an adaptation, it's almost like your script is one level progressed already from the very start. When you are working beyond an adaptation, where in this case they're beyond where the books went, or when you're working without an adaptation, there's an extra level of challenge, which is that you have to create the raw material yourself. You have to create that draft that's not yet a script, that draft that's not yet working, that isn't yet a feature film or a series or a pilot or a final episode or whatever that thing is. You have to create it, and then you have to shape it. And so there's an extra level of shaping that happens that I think potentially these writers were not totally prepared for. Because when I watched the final episode of Game of Thrones, what I think is, and what I've basically thought for all of season 8, and you can listen to my podcasts about this on my website. I get pretty extensive into the analysis of season 8 and exactly what went wrong, but also how easy it would have been to fix it. I don't want to minimize this. When I say easy, I mean a lot of work. But that, in fact, all the elements that were needed to make season 8 great were already there. It's more like we're actually watching a rough draft of season 8. A draft that hasn't been through all those things that we have to go through as screenwriters, which actually makes season 8 incredibly valuable for you to learn from. Because usually when you're studying great movies or great series, usually you're looking at scripts that are really truly done. And you don't realize that even great writers have to go through the same crap you do. That their early drafts don't look perfect and amazing the way you wish they would. That in fact their early drafts are just as much of a mess as yours are. And that they have to go through the same work to make those drafts actually effective. So we're going to talk about what that looks like and how you do that. But before I do, I want to talk about the biggest thing, because obviously there have been issues in Game of Thrones before. There have been small problems. There have been big problems that we have completely forgiven. But this season, most viewers found very difficult to forgive. And so I want to talk about what made everyone so upset. But I also want to talk about what happened to these writers this season that changed everything. And what I'd like to suggest is that even though everyone's asking for Game of Thrones with good writers, I would like to suggest that, in fact, these are good writers. That these are just good writers who have unfortunately showed you a draft a little bit too early, who have shot a draft a little bit too early, which is such a great lesson, because I've seen so many of my students, brilliant writers, shooting drafts just a little bit too early and taking things that should have been moving and powerful, that everyone should have loved, and because they did just a little bit too early, just before they got through that final revision, that they end up not getting the effect that they want for their audience. But there's something very specific that happened to these writers. You probably noticed, if you were watching Game of Thrones, you probably noticed, oh my God, I'm staying up later and later and later. What happened was that Game of Thrones actually changed its format. Instead of doing short episodes, instead of doing 10 short episodes in a season, it started doing fewer, longer episodes. And I would like to suggest that this was actually the biggest mistake that Game of Thrones made, and potentially the main source of the problem that the audience is now responding to. Because when you allow yourself more pages, what happens to you in a rewrite is you have to make fewer choices. When you allow yourself fewer pages, when you try to do everything as quickly as you can, you have to start to make very strong choices about what's your great stuff and what's just your good stuff. What's the stuff you'd love to include, and what's the stuff that, man, it would be great if I could fit it in, but I've got to cut it out. And I think if you look, not just at the final episode, but at this whole season of Game of Thrones, and if you listen to my podcasts about this season of Game of Thrones, it will help you understand how the bloating of these scripts actually affected the editing process. Because the writers didn't have to make those hard decisions about the use of time, they ended up including a lot of stuff that they really should not have. And they ended up moving the characters much more slowly in this season than they have in previous seasons. Most writers think that their script is all about their great trick ending, but this is not true. The truth is, if things are not working along the way, your trick ending isn't going to matter. And if your trick ending doesn't grow out of character, doesn't grow out of the stuff that we care about, it doesn't matter how brilliant and how visual and how epic your storytelling is. And you can see this with episode 5, right? You got freaking dragons blowing up everything. You have a level of spectacle and a level of amount of money spent that you've never seen in a TV series ever before. And nevertheless, your feeling is disappointment, because you care about the characters. When we get to episode 6, what we're actually watching is we're watching 2 hours of denouement, 2 hours of resolution. The writers are attempting to tie up all these loose ends, and you simply cannot do that for 2 hours. If you actually think of the ending of episode 5, that's actually, for me at least, the most powerful moment in Game of Thrones. That moment where Arya approaches the white horse and the horse walks away and rides away. The moment where revenge is let go of, and through this war that we have this moment of beauty. And of course, that's really the message that these writers are trying to send, right? Is like, how do you leave the war behind? And how do you leave the desire for the throne and the desire for vengeance? How do you actually break that wheel and instead go find your white horse and ride off into the sunset? How do you actually pursue your own thing? The problem is, by the time you get to episode 6, all the characters have already changed. And you want to feel sadness at that moment, and I'm warning you, there's a spoiler ahead, but at the moment that Jon Snow stabs Daenerys, you want to feel it. You want to cry at that moment. But the problem is, it's very challenging to cry for a character who's pure evil. What we really needed, and again, I lay out how one could do this in my previous podcast, but there are a million ways to do that. But what you want, the Dany that you want Jon Snow to meet, is not the Dany who is purely bent on viciousness and power, who's going to extend the war forever for sure, who's definitely going to kill his sister and at Winterfell and is going to extend the battle forever. You don't want to meet that Dany. You actually want to meet the Dany who is cognizant of her mistake, or the Dany who you might at least believe is not just manipulating, is actually trying to do something good, so that you and Jon Snow can be in the same position of not being sure, of actually wanting to believe that Dany might not be the person that you're afraid she is. So that's the first thing, is you can't mourn the death of a character that you don't care about anymore, and that you don't believe, whose actions you don't believe. But if there was a way to find a way to that moment where you believed her actions and understood her actions, but also knew her actions were not forgivable, it would put you in the position of Jon Snow, of feeling like, as he says in the episode, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. And that would be extremely powerful. So the movement structurally, you can't take a character who's good, Jon Snow, and always does the right thing, and put him up against a character who's evil and consistently now doing the wrong thing, and have him slay her and be sad about it and us feel anything. We have to be as complicated in our understanding of her as he is. We have to feel the pain with him. But let's assume that moment works. The problem is, what the hell happens next? What happens next is, once again, the same problem we've seen all the way through, which is that neither the characters nor even the dragon can stay in character. Even the dragon, who up till now we've assumed don't have a general sense of morality, up till now who we've assumed their main goal is to protect their mother, and who we understand as reptilian brains, right? Suddenly, rather than making a believable character choice, the dragon makes a symbolic choice of burning down the throne. In order for us to accept this, we have to logically accept that A, dragons understand what a throne